If you step into a medium-sized office in the early 1970s, the first sound you would notice would not be the hum of computers, because there were none in sight, but rather the steady, rhythmic clatter of typewriters. You would hear it echoing through corridors and glass partitions, punctuated by the sharp ring of carriage returns and the occasional thud of heavy stacks of paper being placed on desks. These were the sounds of work, mechanical, repetitive, and unrelenting, and behind most of those machines sat women. In an era before laptops, email, and printers, offices relied on typists to produce nearly all written documents. Whether it was letters, contracts, invoices, or reports, the flow of paperwork could only move forward if someone, usually a young woman, sat at her desk and typed it out by hand. The job was considered entry-level, respectable, and stable, though rarely glamorous. To outsiders, it might appear dull. Yet for many women of the 1970s, it represented opportunity, a chance to earn their own money, to be part of the working world, and to gain a measure of independence that previous generations might have lacked. The workday of a typist was a carefully structured routine. You might imagine a young woman arriving at her office building in a modest skirt and blouse, her hair pinned back neatly, perhaps carrying a brown handbag with her lunch packed inside. She would clock in, settle at her typewriter, most likely a sturdy IBM Selectric by the early 1970s, and prepare for hours of work. The Selectric was considered state-of-the-art at the time. It replaced the old-fashioned moving carriage with a rotating golf ball head that allowed faster, smoother typing. Even so, the machine was loud and heavy, and errors meant restarting entire pages unless correction fluid or erasing strips were used. Speed and accuracy were the prized skills of a typist. Offices often tested applicants by measuring how many words per minute they could produce without error. A good typist might reach 70 or even 90 words per minute, and in competitive secretarial schools, young women trained diligently to achieve such speeds. To type slowly was to fall behind in office productivity. To make mistakes was to risk the displeasure of a supervisor who expected neat, professional documents. In that way, the typist's desk became a site of both pressure and discipline. Yet, much of the job involved monotony. Imagine typing the same form letter dozens of times, only changing the recipient's name at the top. Or retyping a contract because one figure had been misprinted. Or creating carbon copies, thin sheets pressed between papers to duplicate each keystroke, smudging ink onto multiple layers at once. The typist's job was not to question or analyze, but simply to reproduce information in legible, standardized form. The intellectual demand was low, the physical repetition was high. Still, being in an office carried its own quiet significance. Compared to factory or domestic work, typing was considered cleaner and more modern. Offices were heated in winter, cooled in summer, and decorated with potted plants, fluorescent lights, and the faint scent of carbon paper. Break rooms allowed for coffee and small talk. Lunch breaks offered a chance to eat sandwiches or salads with colleagues. For many women, these environments symbolized entry into the middle-class world of business, even if their paychecks and titles kept them far from positions of authority. Social dynamics within the office were layered. Typists were often young, single, and in their 20s, while male managers were older and firmly in charge. The office hierarchy placed women in supportive roles, ensuring that memos, letters, and meeting notes were all prepared on time. Male supervisors dictated content, and women typed it into existence. Promotions were rare, and many typists saw the job as temporary, something to hold until marriage, or a stepping stone to secretarial or administrative work. Yet others built long careers at their desks, quietly filling file cabinets with their labor. The physicality of typing shaped women's days in subtle ways. Fingers ached from constant keystrokes, wrists strained, and backs stiffened from hours of sitting upright. Typewriter ribbons needed replacing, correction fluid left lingering chemical smells, and carbon paper left dark smudges on fingertips. Some women brought cushions for their chairs or small wrist pads, though ergonomics was rarely a formal concern in 1970s workplaces. Complaints of fatigue or eye strain were common, yet rarely considered worthy of reform. Outside the office, the identity of being a working woman was still evolving. In many societies, especially in North America and Western Europe, the 1970s marked a turning point. More women were joining the labor force than ever before, yet cultural expectations still suggested that marriage and motherhood were the ultimate goals. For single women, working as a typist provided financial independence, the ability to rent an apartment, or to buy small luxuries like new clothes or records. For married women, it often provided supplemental income for household expenses. Yet regardless of the purpose, the job tied women's identities to the world of paper, ink, and machine noise. It is easy, today, to dismiss such work as dull. After all, with computers, printers, and email, the tasks of typing have largely disappeared into the background of our daily lives. But in the 1970s, every neatly formatted document you can imagine, the letters, the memos, the applications, required a human being behind a desk, striking keys for hours on end. The scale of this unseen labor is staggering when you consider it: millions of pages typed, copied, and filed by women whose names never appeared on the documents they produced. When we think about history, we often focus on leaders, laws, or dramatic events. Yet the boring rhythm of office work, each keystroke of a typist, was part of the machinery that made businesses, governments, and institutions function. Without it, the paper trails that shaped modern economies might never have existed. And so, the clatter of typewriters in the 1970s was more than just background noise, it was the sound of women stitching together the fabric of bureaucratic life. Their hands kept the paperwork flowing, the offices running, and the systems intact. But even as they filled these roles, new machines were already on the horizon, machines that threatened to change the very nature of their work. If the typewriter was the heartbeat of 1970s office paperwork, then the telephone switchboard was its nervous system, the network that carried signals, voices, and messages from one corner of the world to another. And just as typists were nearly always women, so too were the majority of switchboard operators. Their jobs were less about striking keys and more about connecting wires, listening closely, and facilitating the conversations that held organizations together. To understand the role of a switchboard operator in the 1970s, you must first imagine the telephone system before digital exchanges. Calls were not routed automatically by computers. Instead, they passed through a central board, staffed by human operators sitting in long rows, facing tall panels of jacks, cords, and blinking lights. When a light blinked, it signaled an incoming call. The operator would insert a cord into the appropriate jack, speak politely into her headset, and connect the caller to their desired number. The process sounds mechanical, and it was, but it also required precision and speed. A skilled operator could handle dozens of calls in rapid succession, connecting businesses, government offices, and families across cities and even countries. In the early 1970s, though automation was already creeping in, many workplaces still relied on women operators to direct calls. Whether you were phoning a law office in New York, a factory in Manchester, or a railway station in Toronto, there was likely a woman somewhere on the line making sure your voice reached the right person. A day in the life of a switchboard operator began with order and discipline. Operators often wore headsets that allowed them to keep their hands free for the cords and plugs. Their posture mattered, as sitting too far from the board could slow their reaction times. Training emphasized clear enunciation, polite tone, and efficiency. Every "operator, how may I help you?" had to be delivered with professional calm, no matter how impatient or flustered the caller on the other end might be. The work required constant attention. A moment's delay could result in dropped calls or irritated customers. In many companies, supervisors stood behind the rows of operators, watching to ensure no one lingered too long on personal conversations or made errors in routing. Performance was measured not only by accuracy but also by speed, the number of calls successfully connected in a given hour. For the women themselves, the job was both repetitive and strangely intimate. They were not supposed to listen in, of course, but in the act of connecting calls, snippets of conversations inevitably filtered through their headsets. A hurried voice asking for an overseas connection, a nervous young man calling his sweetheart, a manager summoning an employee into his office, all these fragments passed briefly through the operator's ears before she pulled the plug and moved on. It was, in a way, a front-row seat to the everyday drama of life, but one that could never be acknowledged aloud. The physical environment of a switchboard room was unique. Long panels of cord stretched out before the operators like musical instruments. Lights blinked in patterns that had to be read instantly, each one demanding a precise motion: plug in here, connect there, pull out, and move on. The clicking of plugs, the soft murmur of voices, and the occasional frustrated sigh from a caller formed the soundtrack of the workday. Unlike typewriters, which created a sharp and constant rhythm, switchboards produced a more scattered, irregular noise, punctuated by bursts of activity whenever the lines became busy. Breaks were short but necessary. Hours of sitting upright, eyes fixed on lights, and hands darting to cords could be exhausting. Many operators complained of sore shoulders, stiff backs, and strained eyes. Still, the work offered stability, often with union protection in larger companies, and it was considered respectable employment for women. The gendered nature of the job was no accident. From the early days of telephony in the late 19th century, companies discovered that women's voices were perceived as more polite, soothing, and trustworthy than men's. Customers preferred speaking to women operators, and so the workforce became overwhelmingly female. By the 1970s, this tradition was deeply entrenched. Operating a switchboard was seen as women's work, just as typing or secretarial duties were. Yet, the position carried limits. Operators were rarely promoted beyond their role, and the skills they developed did not easily transfer to higher-paying jobs. While they kept communication flowing for entire organizations, their own voices were often invisible within company hierarchies. Their labor was essential, but their presence was taken for granted. Outside of offices, telephone operators played vital roles in local communities as well. In smaller towns, they sometimes doubled as sources of information, quietly knowing who called whom, when, and how often. Though professional ethics required silence, the reality of small-town life meant that operators occasionally became informal keepers of local gossip. Even in large cities, there was a sense of operators being the hidden hands behind the telephone system, the unseen workers who made modern communication possible. By the mid-1970s, however, the role was under threat. Digital exchanges and automated dialing systems were spreading rapidly, reducing the need for human operators. Where once dozens of women sat plugging cords into panels, a single machine could handle thousands of calls per hour without fatigue or error. For many women, this shift was bittersweet. While it reduced the drudgery of constant cord shuffling, it also eliminated steady jobs that had supported entire families. It is worth pausing here to consider the broader meaning of these roles. Typists and operators were not inventors, executives, or policymakers. They rarely appeared in news headlines. Yet, without them, the flow of modern business would have collapsed. Every memo typed, every call connected, every message passed along. These were the small, boring details that allowed companies and governments to function. Women filled these roles not because they were glamorous, but because they were necessary. And in doing so, they became the quiet backbone of a bureaucratic world. For the listener today, perhaps drowsy and drifting towards sleep, there is something almost soothing about the thought: rows of women at their desks, fingers tapping keys or hands pulling cords, their daily labor weaving together the invisible fabric of modern society. Offices and communication networks hummed along not through dramatic action, but through steady, repetitive effort. But the question lingers: what happens to a workforce when the very machines they operate begin to replace them? If the typewriter was giving way to the computer, and the switchboard to digital exchanges, what future awaited these women whose entire working lives were tied to machines designed for obsolescence? By the mid to late 1970s, the soundscape of the office was beginning to change. The steady clatter of typewriters still dominated, and the clicking of switchboards had not yet vanished entirely, but the early hints of transformation were unmistakable. Machines, sleeker, faster, and far less dependent on human operators, were beginning to replace the very jobs that had defined women's working lives for decades. At first, the changes seemed small. In typing pools, electric typewriters replaced manual ones, reducing some of the physical strain on wrists and fingers. Correction tapes became more common, making it easier to fix mistakes without retyping entire pages. Word processors began to appear in some forward-looking offices, although at first they looked more like strange hybrids between typewriters and computers. These machines could store text on magnetic cards or floppy disks, allowing documents to be revised without starting from scratch. For typists who had spent years fighting with carbon paper and messy correction fluid, this was nothing short of revolutionary. But the revolution carried a hidden cost. If one machine could store and reprint documents endlessly, why did an office need a dozen typists? Managers began to ask such questions, and slowly, typing pools, the large rooms filled with rows of women at their machines, began to shrink. A single secretary with a word processor could now handle the work that once required a team. For switchboard operators, the shift was even more dramatic. Digital switching systems, introduced gradually through the 1960s and 70s, were reaching maturity. Automatic exchanges meant that callers could now dial directly without needing an operator to route them. International calls, once dependent on skilled operators making connections across cables, began to pass through satellites and digital systems. Within a few years, the blinking lights and tangled cords of the operator's console were replaced by silent machines. Entire rooms that had once buzzed with women's voices and hands-on work grew quiet, their purpose erased almost overnight. For many women, these changes were bewildering. Imagine building your identity around your job, learning to type at record speed, mastering the etiquette of telephone calls, only to watch the world move past you. Skills that had been valuable were suddenly outdated. Training that once promised a stable career no longer guaranteed employment. Younger women entering the workforce were encouraged to learn computing skills, while older typists and operators faced the choice of retraining or leaving work altogether. The automation of office work, while efficient, revealed how fragile women's positions had always been in the labor market. Their jobs were not designed to elevate them into leadership but to fill the gaps in administrative systems until machines could take over. Employers had praised them for their patience, accuracy, and reliability, but these very qualities became irrelevant once technology surpassed human speed. Yet, it would be misleading to see this transition as entirely negative. For some women, the new machines opened doors. Secretaries who mastered word processors and early computer systems gained new authority in offices, becoming indispensable to managers who did not yet understand the technology. Women who had once been confined to typing pools could sometimes leverage their familiarity with machines into better pay or more varied roles. The arrival of computers into the workplace created an unexpected space where women could act as early adopters, translating between old office habits and new digital workflows. Still, the broader picture remained one of displacement. Between the late 1970s and the 1980s, the number of traditional typing and operator jobs declined sharply. Entire categories of employment that had once defined women's work simply disappeared. The sound of the office, the click of typewriter keys, the hum of switchboards, faded into memory. In its place came quieter machines, screens glowing with green letters, and the soft tap of computer keyboards. This transition raises a deeper question about the nature of work itself. Was the role of typists and operators ever meant to last? Or were these jobs always temporary? Placeholders in a larger technological evolution. From one perspective, the automation of these roles seems inevitable. Machines are better at repetitive tasks, and businesses constantly seek efficiency. But from another perspective, these jobs represented more than efficiency, they represented human entry into the bureaucratic systems of the modern world. The typist's hands and the operator's voice were the thread stitching society together, even if only for a few decades. For the women themselves, the experience was deeply personal. Some retired early, proud of their years of service but unwilling to adapt to new machines. Others retrained, moving into computer-related work, data entry, or administrative support. Many younger women embraced the change, learning programming or office computing skills that positioned them for new careers in the 1980s and beyond. But in every case, the transition highlighted a truth: women's labor, though essential, was often undervalued and easily discarded when machines promised savings. When we look back now, the stories of typists and switchboard operators may seem boring. They do not contain the drama of wars or revolutions. But they hold a quiet importance. These women were the link between an older world of handwritten letters and face-to-face meetings, and a new world of digital communication and automation. Without their labor, offices could not have functioned in the mid-20th century. Without their willingness to adapt, or to step aside, businesses could not have embraced new technologies as smoothly as they did. There is also something meditative in considering the pace of these changes. Imagine sitting in a typing pool in 1973, the sound of typewriters echoing all around you, unaware that within a decade your entire profession would vanish. Imagine plugging calls on a switchboard in 1975, not realizing that satellites and automated exchanges would soon erase your role. In hindsight, the inevitability of automation is clear. But for the women living through it, the end of their work came gradually, quietly, and often without recognition. Today, few remember the names of the women who filled these offices. Their documents bear no signatures, their calls left no trace. Yet, their work shaped the everyday rhythm of modern life. They were part of the invisible infrastructure of the 20th century, bridging the gap between paper and digital, between human voices and electronic signals. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps it is worth reflecting on this: the sound of typewriter keys, the soft murmur of operators' voices, the constant hum of office machinery, all gone now, but once as ordinary as breathing. Their disappearance reminds us that no job, however stable it may seem, is immune to change. The quiet labor of women in offices shaped the world for a time, and then, like the click of a carriage return or the buzz of a switchboard light, it faded into silence. And so we are left with a question: when today's jobs, whether in offices, factories, or even digital spaces, are eventually replaced by new machines, will anyone remember the human hands and voices that once made them possible? If you picture a hospital in the early 1970s, your imagination might bring up a scene that is at once familiar and distant. The fluorescent lights overhead, the steady squeak of rubber-soled shoes against polished floors, the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with boiled linens, these details haven't changed much. But the lives of the women who worked in those hospitals, especially as nurses, carried rhythms that were shaped by both tradition and transition. By the 1970s, nursing was one of the most common professions for women, and it was widely considered respectable, though rarely well paid. In many countries, hospitals still relied heavily on women to fill nearly every aspect of patient care. While male doctors issued orders and performed dramatic procedures, it was the nurses who carried out the constant, day-to-day labor that kept patients alive, clean, and stable. It was a job that required both physical endurance and emotional stamina, but much like typing or telephone work, it was taken for granted. A nurse's shift often began before dawn. Many nurses lived in modest apartments or dormitories near hospitals, since commuting was impractical with long and irregular hours. Imagine a young woman rising in the dark, quickly pinning her hair back, pulling on her stiff, white uniform and cap, still the standard attire in many hospitals at the time. Her shoes were sturdy but plain, designed for hours of walking. A quick breakfast of toast and coffee might have to suffice before she hurried to the hospital, where the halls were already stirring with activity. Upon arrival, the nurse reported to her station and received updates from the night shift. These handovers were critical, a patient's temperature spiking, a medication that was delayed, or a restless child who had cried through the night. Each detail mattered, because nursing in the 1970s was still largely manual. Machines existed, blood pressure cuffs, oxygen tanks, for drips, but many tasks relied on observation, careful note-taking, and human vigilance. The workload was relentless. A typical nurse might be assigned a ward of 10 or 12 patients, sometimes more, depending on understaffing. She would begin her morning rounds by checking vital signs, pulse, temperature, breathing rate. She would adjust bed sheets, replace soiled linens, and empty bedpans. She would carry trays of food to those who could eat and spoon-feed those who could not. She would lift patients to prevent bedsores, a task requiring both strength and patience. In surgical wards, she cleaned incisions and changed bandages. In maternity wards, she bathed newborns and calmed anxious mothers. None of these tasks were glamorous, and many were unpleasant. But they were essential. A missed observation could mean a patient's sudden decline went unnoticed. A neglected wound could fester into infection. In an era when antibiotics were still developing and monitoring machines were limited, nurses became the eyes, ears, and hands of medicine. Communication shaped much of the job. Nurses took orders from doctors, recorded observations in charts, and reassured families waiting anxiously at bedsides. Yet their own expertise was often dismissed. A nurse might recognize early signs of deterioration, subtle shifts in breathing, a change in skin color, but if a doctor disagreed, her voice carried little authority. This hierarchy was deeply ingrained, men as decision-makers, women as caretakers. For many nurses, this meant balancing quiet professionalism with an undercurrent of frustration. Pay was modest. In the early 1970s, a nurse in the United States earned, on average, less than half the salary of a male factory worker. Overtime was common, and night shifts disrupted sleep cycles, but the extra hours rarely led to substantial financial reward. In the United Kingdom and parts of Europe, nurses often lived in hospital-provided housing, which reduced expenses but blurred the boundary between personal life and work. Many women recalled feeling that they were always on call, even when technically off duty. Despite the low wages and heavy workload, the profession carried a sense of pride. Families respected daughters who became nurses, seeing the role as both caring and respectable. Hospitals often reinforced this image by requiring strict codes of dress and behavior. Uniforms were to be spotless, caps properly positioned, and manners unfailingly polite. A nurse was expected to embody discipline, compassion, and selflessness, qualities celebrated publicly but undervalued materially. The emotional toll of the work was significant. Nurses witnessed suffering daily, often without outlets for their own grief. A child lost to illness, an elderly patient slipping away in the night, a traumatic accident arriving in the emergency ward, these were experiences that left deep marks. Yet, the culture of the time discouraged open discussion of emotional strain. Nurses were expected to carry on silently, absorbing the weight of loss without complaint. Camaraderie among nurses became a survival mechanism. Shared breaks in cramped staff rooms, whispered jokes during long night shifts, and small acts of kindness helped sustain morale. Older nurses mentored younger ones, teaching practical tricks, how to lift patients safely, how to calm someone in pain, how to manage a difficult doctor. These relationships created a hidden culture of resilience within the hospital walls. It is worth noting that nursing in the 1970s was also at a crossroads. The women's rights movements of the era were beginning to challenge gender roles, and some nurses pushed for greater recognition of their expertise. Nursing schools began to emphasize scientific knowledge alongside practical training, preparing women not just as assistants but as professionals in their own right. Yet progress was slow, and many hospitals clung to traditional hierarchies. For the patients, the presence of a nurse often defined the hospital. Experience. Doctors came and went, often briskly, but nurses remained constant, checking in at regular intervals, answering call bells, and offering reassurance in moments of fear. For many patients, especially those far from home, the nurse became a substitute family member, providing not just medical care but also human connection. Looking back, one can see the paradox clearly. Nurses were the underpaid pillars of care, carrying the weight of the hospital system on their shoulders, even as their contributions were minimized in official records. Their labor kept the wards functioning, yet their names rarely appeared in medical histories. As you imagine the dim glow of hospital corridors in the 1970s, with nurses moving quietly from bed to bed, the question arises, how did these women endure such long hours, strict hierarchies, and emotional strain, all while remaining the steady foundation of patient care? If Section 1 gave us the picture of a nurse's daily routine, the hands-on labor of caring for patients, then Section 2 reveals the deeper structures that shaped those routines. Behind every bedpan cleaned, every vital sign taken, and every chart updated lay a framework of rules, hierarchies, and expectations that defined nursing in the 1970s. It was not only the tasks themselves that exhausted nurses, but also the conditions under which they were expected to perform them. A nurse's shift was rarely confined to 8 tidy hours. Hospitals were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and patients needed care without pause. In practice, this meant nurses often worked 12-hour shifts, night duties, or split schedules that left little time for rest. Rotating shifts were especially grueling. One week a nurse might work days, the next week evenings, and the following week nights. Such irregular patterns disrupted sleep cycles, strained family life, and left many women in a constant state of fatigue. Unlike some other professions, nurses could not simply leave work at the office. If a patient took a sudden turn at the end of a shift, the nurse might remain on duty until the situation stabilized. If a ward was short-staffed, existing staff were expected to stay longer, regardless of personal plans. Hospitals ran on the principle of continuity, and continuity meant that nurses often sacrificed their own time to maintain the steady rhythm of care. Within hospital walls, power flowed downward from administrators and doctors to the nurses who carried out their orders. The doctor-nurse relationship in the 1970s was shaped by long-standing tradition. Doctors, predominantly male, diagnosed and prescribed. Nurses, predominantly female, executed instructions. Even when a nurse's experience or intuition suggested an alternative course of action, her authority was limited. There were countless stories of nurses observing early warning signs, a patient's breathing becoming shallow, a sudden change in skin tone, only to have their concerns dismissed by doctors. Sometimes their instincts proved correct, but recognition rarely followed. The culture of the time positioned nurses as obedient assistants, not decision-makers. To challenge a doctor's authority could be seen as insubordination, even if the nurse's intent was to save a life. Even among nurses themselves, hierarchies existed. Senior nurses supervised juniors, enforcing rules of conduct, dress, and procedure. Discipline was strict. Lateness, untidy uniforms, or perceived unprofessional behavior could result in reprimands. Nursing schools and hospitals emphasized obedience as much as skill, reinforcing the idea that a nurse's worth lay in her ability to follow rules without complaint. Perhaps more than any other factor, gender shaped the experience of nurses in the 1970s. Society viewed nursing as an extension of women's natural role as caregivers. The assumption was that women were inherently compassionate, patient, and nurturing, and therefore suited for the long hours of tending to the sick. These stereotypes justified low pay and limited advancement. Why should a profession considered an instinctive extension of motherhood be rewarded like a skilled craft or scientific discipline? Nurses were expected to embody both professionalism and femininity. Their uniforms, especially the white caps still common in the early 1970s, symbolized purity and discipline. They were to be gentle with patients but firm when necessary, deferential to doctors but assertive in emergencies, endlessly patient but never visibly weary. This balancing act was exhausting, requiring constant self-control. Marriage and family life added another layer of pressure. Many hospitals assumed that young nurses would eventually leave the profession to marry and raise children. This assumption shaped policies, limiting long-term career prospects for women who remained. Married nurses often faced discrimination, with employers viewing them as less reliable due to household responsibilities. In some cases, hospitals discouraged hiring married women altogether, preferring single women who could devote themselves fully to work. Nursing education in the 1970s was still transitioning from apprenticeship-style training to more formal academic programs. Many nurses trained directly in hospitals, where they lived in dormitories, wore uniforms even off-duty, and followed strict codes of behavior. Rules governed everything from curfews to personal appearance. While such systems instilled discipline, they also reinforced the idea that nurses were not independent professionals but rather quasi-students under perpetual supervision. The emphasis on discipline sometimes bordered on rigidity. A nurse's handwriting in patient charts had to be neat and precise. Beds had to be made with perfect corners. Uniforms were inspected for stains or wrinkles. These details were not trivial. They symbolized order and control within the hospital environment. Yet they also added layers of pressure to an already demanding job, ensuring that nurses were judged as much for appearance as for skill. Beyond physical exhaustion, nurses bore the burden of emotional labor. They were expected to smile, reassure, and comfort patients even when their own spirits were low. They consoled grieving families, absorbed anger from frustrated patients, and maintained composure in the face of suffering. Unlike doctors, who could retreat to offices between rounds, nurses remained on the ward, continually exposed to raw emotion. And while their compassion was celebrated in rhetoric, it was rarely supported in practice. Hospitals offered little in the way of counseling or psychological support. A nurse might go directly from witnessing a traumatic death to preparing the next patient's bed, with no time to process the experience. Over time, this emotional strain could lead to burnout, though the concept was not widely recognized at the time. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of social change. The 1970s were a decade of women's liberation movements, rising feminist voices, and challenges to traditional gender roles. Outside the hospital, women were demanding equal pay, reproductive rights, and opportunities in professions previously reserved for men. Inside the hospital, however, change was slower. The image of the nurse as a selfless, obedient caretaker persisted, even as women in other fields pushed for recognition and authority. Some nurses joined unions or professional associations, seeking to improve pay and working conditions. Strikes and labor actions occurred in several countries during the 1970s, though these were controversial. After all, striking nurses meant jeopardizing patient care. The tension between professional duty and personal rights was a defining feature of nursing in this period, yet, for all the exhaustion, frustration, and undervaluation, nurses carried on. Their work was quiet but relentless, forming the foundation of hospital care. Every injection administered, every bedpan emptied, every chart updated, these were the details that kept the hospital functioning. Patients might not remember the nurse's name, but they remembered the touch of her hand on their forehead, the reassurance of her voice, the steady presence by the bedside when fear threatened to overwhelm. In many ways, nurses embodied a paradox: they were indispensable and invisible at the same time. Hospitals could not function without them, yet their labor was undervalued, their authority limited, and their contributions overlooked in medical histories dominated by the names of doctors. As we reflect on this era, one must ask, how did nurses reconcile the pride of their profession with the reality of being underpaid, overworked, and overshadowed? How did they maintain their sense of purpose within a system that demanded so much yet offered so little in return? If Section 1 showed us the daily labor of nurses, and Section 2 revealed the hierarchies, discipline, and pressures shaping their lives, then this final section brings the narrative to a resolution. We step back to see how nurses in the 1970s navigated a profession at the crossroads, caught between tradition and transformation, invisibility and recognition, exhaustion and pride. By the mid-1970s, the question of whether nursing was a calling or a career was being debated more openly. For decades, the image of nursing had been rooted in selfless service, often described in religious or maternal terms. But many nurses began insisting that their work required scientific knowledge, technical skill, and professional judgment, qualities deserving of respect, better pay, and authority. Nursing schools increasingly shifted away from hospital-based apprenticeships toward university programs, emphasizing medical science, anatomy, and pharmacology. These changes were slow, uneven, and often resisted by hospitals reluctant to lose cheap student labor. But they marked the beginning of a new identity: nurses as professionals, not just helpers. This transition, however, created a peculiar duality in the 1970s. On the ward, nurses still performed the grueling, repetitive tasks that defined the profession. But in classrooms and conferences, they spoke the language of research, evidence-based practice, and professional autonomy. The gap between the reality of work and the aspirations of reform created both tension and hope. Alongside educational reforms, the 1970s witnessed a rise in collective action among nurses. Many joined labor unions, demanding fair wages, improved staffing ratios, and safer working conditions. Unionization was not universal, and in some places it was met with hostility, but it gave nurses a stronger voice. Strikes by nurses during this period were often controversial. Critics argued that withholding care endangered patients, but nurses countered that chronic understaffing and exhaustion already endangered lives. To them, striking was not abandoning patients but demanding conditions that would allow them to provide safe, sustainable care. These struggles did not transform the profession overnight, but they did plant seeds. Pay improved slowly. Hospitals began to acknowledge the risks of overwork. Some regions introduced limits on shift lengths and requirements for adequate staffing. The movement also gave nurses a collective identity, reinforcing the idea that they were not simply individual caretakers but members of a vital workforce. The 1970s also brought new technologies that reshaped hospital care. Machines for monitoring heart rates, ventilators, and dialysis equipment became more common. While these tools were often associated with doctors, it was nurses who monitored them day and night. Learning to operate and interpret the growing array of machines required additional training and heightened responsibility. Paradoxically, this expansion of technical skill did not always lead to recognition. In many hospitals, the assumption remained that nurses were support staff. Yet, quietly, they became the ones most familiar with the constant rhythms of machines, medications, and patient responses. Doctors might prescribe, but nurses ensured that treatment actually happened. The hospital itself was also changing. Specialization increased, creating more complex divisions of labor. Intensive care units, neonatal wards, and surgical recovery departments required specialized nursing skills. This complexity both expanded opportunities for nurses and deepened the sense of being indispensable yet undercredited. For individual nurses, the 1970s were marked by sacrifice but also small, deeply personal victories. Many balanced their work with raising children, often returning home from night shifts to prepare breakfast and see their children off to school before collapsing into a few hours of sleep. Others delayed or forewent marriage, dedicating themselves fully to their profession. Moments of triumph rarely came in the form of recognition from administrators or large raises in pay. Instead, they appeared in the gratitude of a patient whose pain had eased, in the relief of a family reassured by steady care, in the private knowledge that one had kept another human being alive through skill and attention. In oral histories, nurses from this period often recalled the satisfaction of being there when someone needed them most. They spoke of small gestures, a hand held during surgery prep, a word of encouragement whispered in the night, that patients remembered for decades. These stories reveal a kind of quiet heroism, one that did not rely on prestige or authority but on the simple endurance of showing up, shift after shift. Nursing in the 1970s also existed in the realm of culture. Films and television often depicted nurses through stereotypes, either as saintly angels of mercy or as romantic interests for doctors. Rarely did these portrayals capture the exhaustion, complexity, and professional skill of the job. Such representations reinforced public misconceptions. Patients and their families often underestimated the expertise required to keep wards running. Yet the very invisibility of their labor became part of nursing's identity, a profession built on service so seamless that few noticed its full scope. Still, cracks began to appear in this cultural invisibility. Some nurses wrote memoirs, spoke at conferences, or joined feminist discussions about women's labor. They insisted that their work was not merely an extension of motherhood but a profession with its own body of knowledge. While their voices were often overshadowed, they added to a growing awareness that nursing was undervalued. Change in nursing came gradually, not dramatically. By the end of the 1970s, hospitals remained hierarchical, nurses remained underpaid, and the burdens of long hours and emotional labor persisted. Yet the groundwork for transformation had been laid. Educational reforms meant that the next generation of nurses would be more likely to hold academic degrees. Union activism meant that staffing ratios and wages could not be ignored indefinitely. The feminist movement ensured that discussions of labor equality included nurses, highlighting the injustice of a profession so essential yet so overlooked. For nurses who worked through the 1970s, the sense of accomplishment was not in sweeping reforms but in survival and persistence. They kept hospitals functioning during a period of transition. They trained new generations, mentored younger staff, and quietly pushed boundaries. Looking back, the story of nursing in the 1970s is one of paradoxes. Nurses were highly skilled yet treated as assistants. They were indispensable yet underpaid. Their work was scientific yet dismissed as natural caregiving. They were exhausted yet persevered. And yet, in these paradoxes lies the enduring strength of the profession. Nurses in the 1970s may not have won full recognition or equality. But they carried the weight of healthcare on their shoulders. Without them, hospitals could not have functioned, patients could not have survived, and the medical profession could not have advanced. Their legacy is not only in the reforms that followed but in the quiet, unseen acts of care that define daily life in hospitals. The future of nursing, greater professional authority, advanced practice roles, and stronger voices, was built on the foundation laid by those who worked tirelessly through long shifts in crowded wards 50 years ago. And so we return to the central question: in a system that demanded endless sacrifice yet offered little recognition, what kept nurses going? Was it professional pride, a sense of duty, the bonds with colleagues, or simply the resilience of women who had long been expected to endure? Perhaps it was all of these at once, a quiet persistence that shaped healthcare in ways history rarely records. If you imagine the 1970s workplace, your mind might drift toward office buildings with typewriters clicking, phones ringing, and secretaries shuffling papers. Yet another world existed, less glamorous and often overlooked, the factories where thousands of women worked day after day. These spaces, filled with clattering machines, the smell of oil, and the steady hum of production, were where many women carved out a livelihood. This section explores what it meant to be a woman on the factory floor in the 1970s, the routines, the monotony, the physical demands, and the role these women played in keeping industries alive. By the 1970s, the presence of women in factories was no longer new. During the World Wars, women had filled industrial roles en masse, keeping production going while men fought overseas. Though many were pushed back into domestic life after 1945, a significant portion remained. By the 1970s, factories across the Western world, textiles, electronics, food processing, and light manufacturing, relied heavily on female labor. In countries like the United States, Britain, and Canada, factory work became one of the more accessible options for women without advanced education. In South Asia, Latin America, and other regions, export-oriented industries such as garment manufacturing employed vast numbers of women, often under harsher conditions and for even lower pay. Factories offered women wages, however modest, and a degree of independence. A paycheck meant personal spending power, a contribution to family income, and, in some cases, the ability to live apart from parents or husbands. Yet, as with other jobs dominated by women, the work was undervalued. Factory life in the 1970s followed a rhythm as relentless as the machines themselves. Shifts typically began early, with workers clocking in at designated times. Being late could result in pay deductions or disciplinary warnings. Once on the floor, women faced long hours of repetitive tasks. In a textile mill, for instance, a woman might spend an entire shift feeding fabric into a loom, monitoring for snags, and adjusting threads. In an electronics plant, she might solder tiny wires to circuit boards, her hands steady but her back aching. In food processing, she might stand for hours along a conveyor belt, packaging cans or bottles, each movement timed to the machine's pace. Breaks were short, 15 minutes for tea or coffee, perhaps 30 minutes for lunch. Even these moments were tightly regulated. The machines did not stop, so when one worker paused, others had to pick up the slack. Bathroom breaks were sometimes monitored, especially in high-pressure environments like garment factories, where every second of production mattered to quotas. The monotony was draining. Day after day, women repeated the same movements: snipping, stitching, soldering, packaging. Injuries like repetitive strain, back pain, and eye strain were common. Yet the discipline of the factory floor demanded endurance. Factories were not quiet places. The clatter of sewing machines, the pounding of presses, the buzz of fluorescent lights, and the constant whir of conveyor belts created an environment where conversation was difficult. Ear protection was rare, and many workers left shifts with ringing in their ears. The smells of industry were just as overwhelming: the sharp tang of machine oil, the dusty air of textile fibers, the sweetness of processed foods mingling with disinfectants. For women in chemical or electronics plants, fumes from solvents and soldering materials were a daily hazard, often unrecognized at the time. Despite this sensory overload, women adapted. They learned to read each other's lips over the noise, to move in rhythm with machines, to endure discomfort as part of the job. Factory wages varied by industry and country, but women were consistently paid less than men for similar work. Employers often justified this by claiming that women's wages were supplementary to a husband's income, ignoring the reality that many women were single, widowed, divorced, or the primary breadwinners for their families. In Britain, the Equal Pay Act of 1970 was supposed to address these disparities, but enforcement was weak, and many factories found loopholes. For example, tasks were classified differently depending on who performed them. Men might be credited with skilled assembly, while women doing nearly identical work were labeled unskilled and paid less. In the United States, the situation was similar. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 existed on paper, but implementation lagged. Globally, conditions were harsher still. In export processing zones in Asia and Latin America, women earned a fraction of what their counterparts made in Western factories, often working 12-hour shifts under strict supervision. Despite the hardships, factory work fostered a sense of community among women. Shared struggles created bonds. Women swapped stories during breaks, looked out for each other on the line, and organized informal systems of support. A worker who felt faint might find a colleague quietly covering her task until she recovered. A new recruit would be shown the fastest way to keep up with a machine, tips passed down like unspoken lessons of survival. Humor was a common coping mechanism. Women joked about supervisors, teased each other about mishaps, and found ways to laugh at the absurdities of industrial life. In many places, songs or chants provided rhythm to repetitive work, echoing traditions that stretched back to earlier generations of factory women. For younger workers, especially those entering the workforce straight from school, factories provided not just income but a kind of social world. Friendships formed on the factory floor often lasted for decades, binding women through shared memories of both hardship and resilience. The dangers of factory work were real, though often minimized by employers. In textile mills, cotton dust contributed to brown lung disease, a chronic respiratory condition. In electronics plants, women exposed to toxic chemicals sometimes suffered long-term health effects. Repetitive strain injuries went largely unacknowledged, dismissed as personal weakness rather than occupational hazard. Accidents were also common. Fingers caught in machinery, slips on oily floors, burns from hot equipment, these were part of the daily risks. Safety protocols were minimal, and protective gear was rare. In many countries, women were not even told about the risks they faced, particularly concerning reproductive health and exposure to chemicals. Yet most workers had little choice but to continue. Complaints risked dismissal, and alternative employment was scarce. The factory floor demanded endurance, not only of body but of spirit. For the larger economy, women in factories were largely invisible. Politicians and commentators spoke of industrial progress or economic growth, but rarely acknowledged the hands that made it possible. Behind every shirt stitched, every radio assembled, every packaged meal sat hours of labor by women whose names never appeared in company reports or historical accounts. These women were, in many ways, the hidden engine of the 1970s economy. They kept consumer goods flowing, export quotas met, and households supplied. Without their labor, entire industries would have faltered. Yet recognition was minimal, their contribution absorbed into the broader narrative of industry, without individual acknowledgement that as we leave this first section of factory life, one truth emerges: the work was monotonous, exhausting, and undervalued, yet it was also a lifeline, for industries, for economies, and for the women themselves. Their labor, though often hidden, shaped the daily reality of 1970s society. But this raises a question: in a world where their contributions were vital yet dismissed, how did factory women begin to assert their rights, demand fair treatment, and seek recognition? In Section 1, we stood on the factory floor with women in the 1970s, hearing the hum of machines, feeling the fatigue of repetitive labor, and noticing how invisible their contributions often were. Now, we shift the focus. Beyond the monotony and hardship, there were stirrings of resistance, organization, and transformation. This section explores how women confronted discrimination, demanded fair wages, and carved out spaces for dignity within the industrial world. Factory work in the 1970s laid bare a persistent injustice: women consistently earned less than men, even when performing nearly identical tasks. In Britain, for example, women textile workers in Lancashire often earned around two-thirds of men's wages for similar output. Employers justified this through classifications, labeling men's roles as skilled while calling women's the unskilled or semi-skilled counterpart, even if the difference was minimal. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, women were less willing to accept this quietly. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 in Britain, though slow to take full effect, emboldened women workers. Across industries, they began to demand that the law's promise be fulfilled, pressing unions and employers alike to address disparities. In the United States, women factory workers leaned on the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and the broader Civil Rights Act of 1964, though enforcement remained uneven. Women often found that legal protections existed on paper but required courage, organization, and persistence to turn into reality. One of the most famous examples of women's industrial action came in 1968 at Ford's Dagenham plant in East London, when sewing machinists, most of them women, walked out. They demanded that their jobs be recognized as skilled labor and that they be paid accordingly. Though this strike predated the 1970s by a few years, its effects carried into the decade. The machinists' fight highlighted the issue of unequal pay and demonstrated that women could organize effectively, disrupt production, and force powerful corporations to negotiate. Their victory, partial though it was, inspired women in other factories to consider similar actions. By the 1970s, the memory of Dagenham lingered in break rooms and union halls, fueling a growing willingness to challenge inequality. Unions were a double-edged sword for women factory workers. On the one hand, unions offered collective strength. Joining together under union banners, women gained access to bargaining power, legal support, and the ability to strike without standing entirely alone. On the other hand, unions were often male-dominated, with leadership positions filled by men who prioritized male workers' issues. Women's concerns, such as maternity leave, equal pay, or workplace harassment, were frequently sidelined. In some cases, union leaders actively discouraged women from pressing their claims, fearing that it would cause division or threaten male workers' relative advantages. Despite this ambivalence, many women pushed within unions to make their voices heard. They formed caucuses, lobbied for representation, and used the language of solidarity to remind unions that workers, included women too, while Western factories saw battles over equal pay and union representation, women in the global South faced a different but connected struggle. In countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, and Bangladesh, export-oriented garment factories hired large numbers of women for low wages. These women often worked in conditions reminiscent of 19th-century sweatshops, 12-hour shifts, overcrowded rooms, poor ventilation, and minimal safety standards. Supervisors enforced strict discipline, timing bathroom breaks and penalizing slow work. For many, the work was grueling but offered one of the few alternatives to agricultural labor or domestic service. Women in these factories also began organizing, though at great personal risk. Strikes could lead to mass firings, police intervention, or worse. Yet their actions laid the foundation for later labor movements that would challenge multinational corporations and demand accountability for working conditions. Not all forms of struggle were dramatic strikes or organized protests. Much of women's resistance in factories was quiet, improvised, and daily. Some slowed their pace to resist unrealistic quotas, protecting their bodies from exhaustion. Others found ways to stretch break times by a few minutes, reclaiming small moments of rest. Jokes, songs, and camaraderie on the factory floor were themselves acts of resilience, turning spaces of monotony into places of shared identity. Even the act of demanding fairness from a supervisor, challenging favoritism or refusing an unsafe task, was a form of courage in environments where discipline was strict and job security fragile. At its core, the struggle of factory women was not only about wages but also about respect. Women were often treated as temporary workers, assumed to leave once they married. Supervisors belittled them, questioning their seriousness. The broader culture reinforced these dismissive attitudes, framing factory women as merely earning pin money, even when they were the primary breadwinners. By organizing, striking, or simply enduring with dignity, women asserted their value. They demanded acknowledgement not as secondary earners but as essential contributors to both household survival and national economies. At its core, the struggle of factory women was not only about wages but also about respect. Women were often treated as temporary workers, assumed to leave once they married. Supervisors belittled them, questioning their seriousness. The broader culture reinforced these dismissive attitudes, framing factory women as merely earning pin money, even when they were the primary breadwinners. By organizing, striking, or simply enduring with dignity, women asserted their value. They demanded acknowledgement not as secondary earners but as essential contributors to both household survival and national economies. The 1970s women's liberation movement intersected with factory struggles in subtle but important ways. Feminists drew attention to the undervaluation of women's work, challenging the idea that factory labor performed by women was less skilled or less valuable. Public campaigns highlighted the hypocrisy of praising industrial growth while underpaying the very women who powered it. Academic studies and activist pamphlets documented working conditions, giving visibility to lives that were often ignored. Though many factory women did not identify directly with feminist movements, seeing them as middle-class or distant, the ideas trickled into public discourse, lending legitimacy to their demands. Throughout the 1970s, women in factories won incremental victories. Some secured wage increases through strikes or legal challenges. Others gained maternity leave provisions or modest improvements in safety standards. In some countries, women succeeded in breaking into supervisory roles, though rarely into higher management. Yet barriers persisted. Pay gaps remained stubborn. Factories continued to rely on women for the most monotonous, repetitive tasks, reserving better-paid skilled roles for men. Discrimination was rarely overtly admitted but quietly practiced through hiring, promotions, and job classifications. One of the more remarkable developments of the late 1970s was the growing recognition that women's struggles in factories were global. Reports of conditions in Asian garment plants, Latin American electronics factories, and Western textile mills began to circulate internationally. Labor activists drew connections, highlighting how multinational corporations exploited women workers across continents. Though communication was slower than today, these links planted seeds for later transnational movements. The idea that factory women, whether in Manchester, Detroit, or Seoul, shared common struggles became a quiet but powerful realization. By the close of the 1970s, women in factories had carved out new spaces for themselves. They had organized strikes, challenged unions, fought for legal rights, and begun to demand recognition. Yet the broader structures of inequality remained stubborn. Factories still ran on the assumption that women's labor was cheap, replaceable, and secondary. This tension leaves us with an unresolved question: despite the courage and persistence of these women, why did industrial systems remain so resistant to fully valuing their contributions? And what would it take to transform not just wages or conditions, but the very perception of women's place in the factory world? By the late 1970s, women who worked in retail shops and clerical offices had become an ordinary part of the American economic landscape. To walk into a department store was to see women behind perfume counters, arranging racks of clothing, or ringing up sales. To walk into an office was to hear the steady tapping of typewriters, the clicking of adding machines, and the measured tones of voices answering telephones. These sounds and images seemed so normal, so everyday, that it was easy to overlook the deeper transformations they represented, not just for women, but for the fabric of American labor itself. The promise of clerical and retail work had always been tied to stability. Unlike factory jobs, which demanded heavy physical exertion, these occupations were framed as clean and respectable. Employers presented them as suited to women, even flattering them as natural office assistants or customer service representatives. But this language masked an important reality: these jobs were also carefully constrained. Women were rarely promoted beyond secretary or sales associate. Men still dominated managerial roles, setting wages and determining schedules. A woman might spend 20 years at the same desk or counter and yet remain locked in the same position, with little chance of advancement. Still, the 1970s introduced subtle but meaningful shifts. The women's liberation movement had begun pressing questions about workplace discrimination. Activists highlighted the wage gap, pointing out that secretaries earned far less than male clerks, even when their work demanded similar or greater skill. Laws such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1963 Equal Pay Act had promised protections, but in practice, enforcement was uneven. By the mid-1970s, more women were filing complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, challenging unfair pay and hiring practices. These challenges rarely overturned the system overnight, but they created ripples, reminders to employers that women's labor could no longer be taken entirely for granted. At the same time, technology was beginning to reshape the office. Word processors and early computers were slowly introduced, changing the pace and nature of clerical work. For many secretaries, learning to operate new machines was both an opportunity and a burden. Training offered a way to stay relevant in a changing office environment, but it also meant more skills for the same stagnant wages. Employers praised women for adapting quickly to technology, yet rarely compensated them for what was essentially a new layer of expertise. The paradox of progress, doing more for the same pay, became a quiet but familiar refrain. In retail, the pressures came from a different direction. Shopping malls expanded rapidly across the suburbs, and with them came new opportunities for women to work as cashiers, sales associates, and store managers. But the growth of retail also brought stricter corporate control. Chain stores introduced uniform dress codes, scripted sales pitches, and tightly monitored schedules. What had once felt like personable neighborhood work increasingly became standardized, depersonalized labor. Women were often expected to stand for hours, maintain a cheerful demeanor, and handle demanding customers, all for wages that barely kept up with inflation. Behind the public image of helpful clerks and efficient secretaries, exhaustion often set in. Women went home after long days to prepare meals, clean, and care for children, since household labor still fell disproportionately on their shoulders. The dual expectations, productive at work, responsible at home, created a quiet strain. Some women found ways to balance both roles, while others felt trapped in what historians later called the double shift. It was not glamorous, nor was it often acknowledged, but it defined the lives of millions. Yet within these quiet struggles, seeds of change were planted. Some secretaries began to organize, forming associations to advocate for professional recognition. Publications like 9 to 5, the National Association of Working Women, provided a platform for clerical workers to share experiences, compare wages, and demand respect. In Boston, Cleveland, and other cities, 9 to 5 groups staged protests, wrote newsletters, and even walked out of offices to highlight unfair treatment. Though often small in scale, these movements drew attention to the fact that pink-collar labor was not simply passive work, it was skilled, undervalued, and ripe for recognition. Cultural representations reinforced this slow shift in perception. Films, television shows, and novels began to depict the everyday lives of working women, sometimes satirizing the monotony, sometimes dramatizing the injustices. By the end of the decade, the image of the secretary or saleswoman was no longer invisible, it was becoming a recognizable figure in the public imagination. This visibility did not immediately translate into higher wages or promotions, but it mattered. To be seen, even imperfectly, was a step toward acknowledgement. For the women who lived these realities, however, the changes felt uneven. Some gained modest pay raises, others were promoted to supervisory roles. But many continued to spend their lives at the same desks and counters, repeating the same tasks. The promise of liberation often seemed distant, filtered through the slow grind of daily routines. Yet there was also a quiet pride in endurance. Women took satisfaction in mastering their machines, in forming friendships with colleagues, in providing for families with steady, if modest, incomes. Their contributions may not have shaken headlines, but they kept offices running and stores open, an essential, if invisible, foundation of modern life. And so, the story of women in retail and clerical work during the 1970s ends on an ambiguous note. Progress was real but incomplete. Recognition was growing but not guaranteed. The typewriters and registers of that decade have long since been replaced by digital systems, but the questions raised by those women remain relevant. What is the value of work that is taken for granted? How do societies measure labor that is constant, quiet, and unglamorous? And will the dignity of those who keep the world orderly ever be fully acknowledged, or will it always remain hidden behind the counter and beneath the hum of the office machine? If you were to step inside a garment factory in the 1970s, the first thing you would notice was the sound. A steady, mechanical hum filled the air, punctuated by the sharp clack of scissors and the occasional hiss of steam from an iron. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women sat in long rows, their bodies bent slightly forward, their feet pressing rhythmically on sewing machine pedals. The room carried a faint smell of fabric dust, machine oil, and coffee from the thermoses many workers kept at their side. This was the world of the garment industry, a place where women, especially immigrant women, stitched shirts, dresses, and trousers that would line store racks across America. The labor was repetitive and often exhausting, but it was also central to the economic life of the 1970s. At a time when fashion trends moved quickly, from the bohemian skirts of the early decade to the sharp suits and polyester leisurewear of the later years, someone had to make the clothes. And in the hidden spaces of urban factories, it was women's hands that turned bolts of fabric into finished garments. The garment industry had long been a site of women's labor, stretching back to the sweatshops of the early 20th century. By the 1970s, many of the same dynamics remained in place: long hours, low wages, crowded conditions, and little protection. Factories were often tucked into aging buildings in New York's Garment District, Chicago's South Side, or Los Angeles's industrial neighborhoods. The work environment was noisy and physically demanding. Women sat shoulder to shoulder, their backs aching from the endless repetition of stitching seams, hemming sleeves, attaching collars, or pressing finished pieces. Breaks were short, and supervisors were quick to scold any slowdown. The workforce was diverse, reflecting the waves of immigration that had reshaped American cities. Puerto Rican women made up a significant portion of the garment workers in New York, while Mexican and Central American women filled similar roles in Los Angeles. Chinese and Korean women, many newly arrived, found jobs in smaller workshops where employers often spoke their language but paid in cash, with little regard for labor laws. African American women also held positions in the industry, particularly in Midwestern cities, though they often encountered barriers to advancement. The common thread was that most of the workers were women, many of them supporting families on wages that barely covered rent and groceries. The pay system itself often added to the strain. Many factories used piecework, meaning workers were paid by the number of items they completed rather than by the hour. This created constant pressure to move faster, to sew without pause, to push the machine to its limits. A skilled worker could earn a bit more by increasing her speed, but the margins were thin. If a machine broke down or fabric ran out, earnings dropped instantly. In this system, time was literally money, and every delay cut into already modest wages. Life inside the factory was shaped by repetition, but also by solidarity. Women shared stories across the rows of machines, trading advice about landlords, schools, and doctors. They brought food from home, rice and beans, dumplings, tamales, and sometimes shared it during hurried lunch breaks. They celebrated birthdays quietly, with a slice of cake passed down the row. In these small gestures, community was built, a buffer against the harshness of the work itself. Yet tensions always lurked just below the surface. Supervisors, usually men, watched for mistakes and enforced quotas. The relationship between management and workers was often strained, with complaints about unfair wages, unsafe conditions, or verbal abuse common but rarely addressed. In the smaller workshops, conditions could be even worse. Windows might be nailed shut, ventilation poor, and emergency exits blocked by stacks of fabric. Workers were expected to endure. For many women, the garment factory was both a lifeline and a trap. It offered wages at a time when options were limited, especially for immigrants with limited English skills. But it also consumed long hours, leaving little time for family or rest. Mothers often rose before dawn to prepare children for school, worked 8 to 12 hours bent over a sewing machine, then returned home to cook dinner, wash clothes, and tend to household needs. The double burden of wage work and domestic responsibility was relentless. The irony was hard to ignore. The clothes these women made were often destined for stores they themselves could not afford to shop in. A neatly stitched dress might hang in a Manhattan boutique, admired by women browsing on their lunch break, while the woman who sewed it hurried home on the subway, her paycheck already stretched thin. The disconnect between production and consumption underscored the invisibility of their labor. And yet, As the decade unfolded, change was in the air. The 1970s were a time of labor unrest and organizing across many industries, and garment workers were no exception. Unions like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, sought to protect workers' rights, pushing for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Their organizing efforts would play a key role in shaping the story of garment workers in this decade, though progress would come unevenly and often at great personal cost. Still, before we move toward the strikes, marches, and negotiations of the late 1970s, it is worth pausing in this first section to sit with the sound of the factory floor. The hum of sewing machines, the clatter of scissors, the voices raised in conversation and sometimes in song. These were the ordinary sounds of survival, the background music of a labor force that stitched together not only garments but also the fabric of urban life in America, and as you sit with that sound, perhaps you might ask yourself, what does it mean when the clothes you wear carry the hidden stories of the women who made them? The garment industry in the 1970s was built on speed, precision, and invisibility. Women worked long days at humming machines, their labor folded into the seams of dresses and shirts that bore no trace of the hands that had stitched them. But beneath the surface hum of production, something else was beginning to stir, a quiet determination to push back against exploitation, to demand recognition, and to fight for conditions that treated their work as the skilled labor it was. By this decade, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, had already existed for more than half a century. It had grown out of the struggles of earlier garment workers, many of them Jewish and Italian immigrant women who had fought in the sweatshops of the early 1900s. Their legacy still lingered in the chants of union meetings and in the posters that decorated union halls. But the workforce had changed. By the 1970s, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, Chinese, and Korean women were the ones filling the rows of machines. Many spoke little English, and many were hesitant to confront authority figures, particularly if their immigration status was precarious. For organizers, this presented both a challenge and an opportunity: how to bring together a new generation of workers under the banner of a union rooted in earlier struggles. The ILGWU attempted to adapt. Organizers began printing leaflets in Spanish, Chinese, and Korean. Meetings were held in church basements, community centers, and even apartments, places where women felt more comfortable gathering after long shifts. The union offered not just advocacy but also services, English language classes, legal aid, and even recreational activities, to build trust and strengthen solidarity. In many ways, the union became more than a workplace advocate, it was a cultural bridge, helping immigrant women navigate life in American cities while also pushing them to see their labor as worthy of dignity and protection. Strikes, however, were not easy. Walking out of a factory meant risking not only a paycheck but sometimes a job entirely. For women already struggling to support families, the decision to strike could feel impossible. And yet, there were moments in the 1970s when frustration boiled over into collective action. In New York's Chinatown, Chinese garment workers organized a series of strikes that drew thousands of women into the streets. They marched with hand-painted signs and chanted in both English and Chinese, demanding fair contracts and respect. The sight of row upon row of women, most wearing simple work clothes, many carrying children in their arms, was both startling and powerful. These demonstrations were more than workplace protests, they were public declarations that the women who stitched America's wardrobes would no longer remain silent. They challenged stereotypes that garment workers were submissive or voiceless. They showed that immigrant women, often dismissed as temporary or marginal, could exercise agency and solidarity. And they underscored a truth that employers preferred to ignore: without these workers, factories would fall silent. Union leaders were not the only ones paying attention. Feminist groups, increasingly focused on workplace inequality, began to see garment workers as part of the larger struggle for women's rights. Journalists covered the strikes, drawing attention to the harsh realities of sweatshop conditions that persisted even in the late 20th century. The broader public, who had once viewed garment labor as something that belonged to the past, was reminded that it remained a present-day reality, hidden in plain sight in the heart of modern cities. Still, resistance came at a cost. Employers often retaliated by threatening layoffs, cutting hours, or relocating factories entirely. The garment industry was already beginning to shift overseas during this decade, as companies sought cheaper labor. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and later China. This global restructuring weakened the bargaining power of American workers, who now faced not only their employers but also the relentless pressures of international competition. For many women, the fight for dignity at work was overshadowed by the looming threat of factories closing altogether. Inside the factories that remained, the push for unionization created tensions between workers. Some women, fearful of losing jobs, opposed strikes or refused to join the union. Others argued fiercely for solidarity, insisting that short-term risk was worth the long-term gains. The factory floor became not only a site of production but also a stage for debate, negotiation, and sometimes division. Yet even in disagreement, the act of discussing wages, rights, and conditions was itself transformative. It turned what had once been silent endurance into a shared political language. The cultural significance of these movements went beyond wages and contracts. They reshaped how garment workers saw themselves. A woman who had once viewed her labor as invisible drudgery might, after marching with thousands of others, begin to see herself as part of a larger historical struggle. The very act of demanding recognition planted seeds of self-worth. It was not just about money, it was about dignity, identity, and the right to be seen. By the end of the decade, the victories were mixed. Some workers won better contracts and modest wage increases. Others saw their factories shuttered as production shifted overseas. The unions had succeeded in amplifying voices, but they could not stop the tides of globalization that were reshaping the entire industry. What remained, however, was a sense of possibility, a recognition that garment workers, often dismissed as powerless, could and did assert themselves. And yet, a lingering question remained. As the industry shifted beyond America's borders, who would carry the torch of resistance? Would the struggles of the 1970s garment workers echo in the factories of Seoul, Dhaka, or Guangzhou, where the hum of sewing machines was just beginning to rise? Or would their hard-won lessons fade into obscurity as the threads of production stretched farther across the globe? By the late 1970s, the sound of sewing machines in American garment factories had begun to fade. For decades, the industry had been the beating heart of immigrant women's labor, with neighborhoods like New York's Chinatown, Los Angeles's Boyle Heights, and Chicago's Near West Side thrumming with workshops that transformed bolts of fabric into clothing destined for stores across the nation. But now, change was underway, change that would stretch the geography of labor across oceans, redraw the boundaries of production, and redefine what it meant to be a garment worker. The pressure to reduce costs had always haunted the industry. Garment production was labor-intensive, and wages, even when modest, were among the highest expenses for manufacturers. The globalization of trade and the development of container shipping in the mid-20th century opened new possibilities. Factories in South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and later Bangladesh and China, could produce clothing for a fraction of the cost. By the late 1970s, American companies began shuttering domestic plants and contracting production abroad, chasing cheaper labor markets. For the women who had spent years at the machines, this shift was devastating. Entire neighborhoods saw their economic foundations erode. A woman who had stitched dresses in a New York loft factory suddenly found her job gone, with little warning and few alternatives. Some turned to part-time service work. Others tried to retrain, though opportunities were scarce, especially for those with limited English proficiency. The familiar rhythm of daily factory life, clocking in, sitting at the same machine, sharing lunch breaks with friends, was abruptly broken. The unions that had once been strong enough to bring thousands into the streets found themselves fighting a different kind of battle. How could a strike in New York or Los Angeles force change when production had already moved to Seoul or Manila? How could solidarity be maintained across borders where laws, wages, and languages differed so drastically? The International Ladies' Garment Workers Union attempted to expand its reach, advocating for fair trade agreements and worker protections abroad. Yet their influence was limited. The speed and scale of globalization simply outpaced the ability of unions to keep up. This unraveling exposed an uncomfortable reality: the gains of American garment workers were fragile, tied to an industry always seeking the lowest costs. For immigrant women who had risked so much to demand dignity in their workplaces, the outsourcing of jobs felt like a betrayal. Their demands had not been excessive: basic safety, fair pay, and respect, but even these were deemed too costly in an economy increasingly driven by global competition. And yet, the story did not end in silence. The spirit of resistance, once stitched into the fabric of American labor, traveled with the industry as it crossed borders. In the 1980s and beyond, women in South Korea, Bangladesh, and China began organizing in their own factories. They faced conditions strikingly similar to those of earlier immigrant workers in New York tenements or Los Angeles lofts: long hours, low pay, unsafe environments. And just as before, women found ways to assert their collective strength, launching strikes, forming unions, and demanding recognition. In a sense, the fight of the 1970s garment workers had planted seeds that took root in new soil. In the United States, the legacy of garment workers lived on in subtler ways. Some former workers became active in community organizing, bringing the lessons of solidarity into housing struggles, education campaigns, and immigrant rights movements. Others passed down stories to their children and grandchildren, who would remember not only the hardships but also the pride of having fought for dignity in a system stacked against them. Even the popular image of the sewing machine, a symbol of quiet domestic labor, became reimagined in cultural memory as an emblem of endurance and resistance. Looking back, it is tempting to view the 1970s garment workers as part of a vanishing world, swept away by the tides of globalization. But to do so would miss the deeper thread running through their history. Their story was not just about stitching clothes, it was about stitching identities, communities, and movements. It was about women who, despite language barriers, poverty, and discrimination, found the courage to insist that their labor mattered. And so the question lingers: when we look at a label today, made in Bangladesh, made in China, made in Vietnam, do we see only a price tag, or do we also sense the continuity of struggle that binds us to those workers? The hum of the sewing machine may have moved from New York lofts to Dhaka warehouses, but the rhythm is the same, the labor is the same, and the demand for dignity remains unchanged. The garment workers of the 1970s left behind more than seams and stitches. They left behind a quiet, persistent reminder that behind every piece of clothing is a human story, one of endurance, invisibility, and, at times, resistance. Whether in a dimly lit factory in Manhattan or a crowded workshop overseas, the question persists: how long will societies measure labor only by cost, and not by the people who give it life?